So it's time to have a look at a plugin, and this time it's the Abbey Road TG Mastering Chain plugin from Waves. And this is a plugin that is made for mastering and for mixing, and it's modeled after the EMI TG12410 transfer console that is used at the Abbey Road studios in their mastering suites. And it was designed in the early 70s, and it was used in several of EMI's recording studios back then. And it was originally made for mastering vinyl records. And this is a plugin that I use myself when I'm mastering, not on every record, but it's a plugin that I will use occasionally, and I use it for one very specific reason. I will show you exactly how I use it a bit later in the video, but first I think we should have a closer look at what this plugin can do. So first of all, what is a transfer console? Well, simply put, it's the thing that is connected in between the tape machine and the cutting lathe when cutting the vinyl master. Audio mastering in the early 70s was mainly about transferring mixes from analog tape onto a master lacquer that would be used for vinyl replication. And the mastering engineer needed to make sure that the mix from the recording studio was transferred to the lacquer in the best way possible, and that the audio signal stayed within the limits of what was possible to put on a vinyl record. A transfer console usually had some way to adjust the level and stereo balance of the sound coming off the tape, and also a way to equalize and to filter the sound, and some way to control the dynamics, and finally a way to set the output level going to the cutting lathe. This transfer console also had a few extra features, like being able to choose the playback EQ for the tape in a convenient way, and also some additional features for manipulating and evaluating a stereo signal. And many of these things is what you would find in a modern transfer console used for mastering nowadays as well. The biggest difference is that instead of going from tape to a cutting lathe, you would nowadays go from digital files in a DAW back to digital files in a DAW. And me and Sofia, we no longer use a physical transfer console when we are mastering, since we're all digital nowadays. But we still have a similar basic workflow of setting input levels, EQing, doing other stuff, and then setting the output levels. So this plugin makes a lot of sense to me as a mastering engineer. If I add a peak limiter afterwards, I would have a somewhat complete mastering chain. It would be quite limited in what it could do, but I would have the basic parts in place at least. So let's have a look at the different parts of this plugin. So the plugin has 5 different modules. There is the input module, the tone module, the limiter module, the filter module, and the output module. And the 3 modules in the middle can be moved around, so you can switch the order of them in any way you want. The first module, the input module, and the output module are not movable, but the 3 in the middle are. And the first 4 modules also have an expanded view where you can see more settings. So by clicking the button in the top right corner of each module, then you can enter the expanded settings, and then you can also reach the other modules from these buttons at the top. And you can enable and disable each module by clicking the top left of each module. The input level and the balance are what I would consider to be the most useful parameters of this module. The pole can be useful for flipping the polarity of one of the channels. I find it quite rare that I would need to do that in a mastering situation, but it's possible to do it. And the transpose will switch place between left and right, so it will flip the stereo image. Can also be useful, but not that common. The tape equalizer is mainly left for historic reasons. There is not that much use for that nowadays. The phase control will shift the phase of the left or right channel. As far as I can tell, it is using all pass filters to accomplish a 90-degree phase shift. I have never used this while mastering. I can't really imagine a situation where I would use this, but I could definitely see creative uses for this during mixing or production. As far as I can tell, the things that are happening in the input module is purely filtering and gain changes. I haven't been able to find any sort of distortion or noise or things like that. It does seem to add a DC filter, a high-pass filter set at a very low frequency. That won't affect the sound that much, but it's not completely transparent, even at a neutral setting. But I would guess that this is also a feature of the original hardware. So the next module is the tone module, and this is a 4-band EQ. Each band has a small set of frequencies that you can select, and then you have a gain, and you can also set the filter type, either a low shelving or a high shelving or 3 different peak filters. It has a blunt setting, which is a wide type of filter, low Q value. It has a medium blunt setting, and it has a sharp setting. And as far as I can tell, this module does pretty much what it says it will do. It's a 4-band equalizer with quite gentle filters, and it's not very good for making more precision notches at specific frequencies, for example. But it's perfectly fine for setting the overall tone. And one thing you can do with this module is to go into the expanded mode and set the stereo mode of this module to MS. Then you can adjust the mid channel and the side channel separately. And that can be useful if you want a bit more width in the high end, for example, then you can do it like that. Or if you want a bit more width in the bass or a bit more narrow bass or something like that, then you can do some basic MS EQing. So that's a cool feature. Personally, I don't use this section at all, but that's not because this sounds bad in any way. It sounds perfectly fine. I just find it easier to do the equalization in other plugins. And as far as I can tell, when I have measured and listened and examined this plugin, this module is also only doing filtering. There is no added distortion or other dynamic or nonlinear processing happening in this module. So it's a basic, good sounding equalizer. And the next module is the limiter section, and I will get back to this module a bit later. The next module is the filter module. And here we have a low pass filter for removing high end, and we have a high pass filter for removing low end. And there is also a presence filter. And as far as I can tell, this is just a peak filter with a preset Q value. And I noticed the same thing with this module. There doesn't seem to be any distortion or other non-linearities added. It's just filtering. And when enabling it, there will be a high pass filter enabled even at the lowest setting. And that's probably what's happening in the original hardware as well. And the last module is the output module. Here we have an output level, which is simply a gain. We can also adjust the stereo width and make it a bit narrower or a bit wider. And as far as I can tell, this is simply adjusting the level of the side signal. And then there are a few buttons where you can listen to the stereo signal in different ways. In a mastering situation, you would probably have it at stereo most of the time. So I intentionally left the dynamics module, the limiter module, for last, because this is the most interesting part of this plugin, I would say. This is the module where I could actually find some distortion and non-linearities. And these are the kind of things that I find interesting in plugins that are modeled from analog hardware. Because gain changes and equalization and filtering, that's something that I will usually do in other plugins, in other stages of the processing chain. So I find it useful to have these sort of things, but that's not what I'm looking for when I'm evaluating a plugin, especially if it's a plugin that is modeled on analog hardware. In those cases, I'm more interested in finding the distortion, finding the character. And this is where I think that this plugin does a very good job. So let's have a closer look at this dynamics module. So this is a compressor, and it has 3 different modes. We have the original mode, we have a modern mode, and a limit mode. And the original and limit are based on the original hardware. It uses an old type of compressor design, of a VCA design, that will distort the signal more than a modern compressor would. So in this plugin, they've also added a modern mode where the VCA is not distorting as much as it does in the original. I tend to like compressors that have a lot of character, because I'm usually not looking for actually reducing the dynamics when I'm using a compressor. I'm more looking for the imperfections of the compression. I'm looking for what it does with the transients while it is compressing. Because nowadays, if I want to just reduce the dynamics in the most transparent way, then there are solutions for that. I can either automate it, or I can use a clean compressor like the TDR Kotelnikov, for example, which has a very clean and transparent sound. But the thing that I like about this compressor is that it adds a lot of character without needing to do much gain reduction. And that's why I like the original setting best, because that will add a bit of distortion. It will affect the sound of the transients, especially when mastering music that already has quite pronounced transients, like kick and snare drum in a rock mix, for example. Or if it's a jazz mix with horn stabs or something like that, where there is sort of accentuated transients, then certain types of compression can help with those transients and make them either stand out a bit more, or maybe round them off a bit, or maybe make them more sharp sounding, and so on. So different compressors will give different results. We talked a bit about that in the video about the Glue, which has that SSL bus compressor kind of character. And this compressor has a slightly different flavor, and that flavor is most present in the original mode. And then we have the recovery parameter. This is sort of a combined attack and release setting. And 1 is the quickest and 6 is the slowest. And for full mixes, I tend to prefer the slower settings, the 4, 5, and 6 settings. The first 3 settings can sound good as well, but I find that the attack might be a bit short for using on a full mix. They can tend to eat into the transients a bit too much. I will usually begin by setting it to 4, 5, or 6. And then we have the ratio control, and this goes from 1 to 100. So it's not the sort of normal ratio control that you would find in a modern compressor, but that doesn't really matter. I think of this as going from no compression to lots of compression. So I will need to use my ears to find the right setting. This compressor has a very wide knee, so the gain reduction will be quite gentle over a quite large dynamic range. So there is often a wide range of settings that will sound good, in my experience. And the ratio control will also apply some form of makeup gain. So the gain will change when changing the ratio. But you also have a separate makeup gain control for tweaking. And then there is a mix control, and this will let you blend between the clean signal and the compressed signal. And this is also something I find very useful with this compressor, because it lets me decide how much of this character do I want to have in the sound. And one interesting feature of this compressor is the gain reduction meter, because it is affected by the mix parameter. So if I play some music and adjust the ratio to get some gain reduction, then if I use the mix control, then this will affect what the gain reduction meter is showing. That's kind of a cool feature. And then you can also set the compressor to work on the stereo signal, or you could unlink the left and right channel and have them being compressed separately, or you could use it in MS mode and compress the mid channel and the side channel separately. If you want full control over this, then you can switch into the expanded mode, and then you get separate controls for the left and right channel, or the mid and side channel if you're using the MS mode. I prefer to use either the stereo mode or the duo mode. And when I use the duo mode, then I will also press the link button. This button will not link the side chains when using duo mode, but it will link the controls, so you get the same settings on both channels. And choosing between stereo mode or duo mode is kind of a personal choice depending on the mix. I tend to prefer using the dual channel mode, because the small amounts of gain reduction that I use will tend to not mess with the stereo image that much. To my ears, it will rather add some excitement to the stereo image when when the channels are treated a little bit differently. But it all depends on the mix. If it's a pristine jazz mix or if it's a classical recording, then I would probably not use this kind of compression in the first place, but then I would also probably have the channel linked if I were to use compression on that kind of music. But for a rock mix where intensity and excitement might be more important than having a perfect stereo image, then I would most often use the duo mode instead. So to get started using this compressor, I would set the stereo mode to duo, I would set the compressor mode to original, I would set the recovery to 4, 5 or 6, and I would set the makeup gain to 0 to start with. I will set the mix to 100%, and then I will tweak the ratio so that I get approximately up to 5 dBs of gain reduction. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but I want to have a fair amount of gain reduction. This is not the amount of gain reduction that I will end up with, but it's a starting point. And at this point, I would have a listen and see what kind of recovery setting I should have. Here I will listen for how the transients are affected and where I get the kind of effect that I'm looking for. At this point, it will be very exaggerated. If I hit play, you can hear that there's a lot of compression going on. And I think for this music, I think the 4 setting is the most appropriate. And I know that these kinds of details translate very badly in a YouTube video, so I will not go deeper into this. We do go a lot deeper into compression and attack and release settings and how it affects transients and so on in our mastering course. And you can find a link in the description if you want to have a closer look at that. But in this example, I think this recovery is a good setting. So the next thing I will do is to adjust the makeup gain. And here I want to make the compressed version and the bypassed version approximately the same loudness. And to set this, you can switch between bypassed and enabled and make sure that there are no big jumps in loudness. And if you're using Reaper, you can also use the Delta Solo feature and adjust the makeup gain to make this signal as quiet as possible. So at this stage, we have a very compressed signal with lots of character. So the next step is to reduce the mix so that we get only as much of this character as we want. And I usually end up somewhere between 15 and 20%, about 9 o'clock. And since the makeup gain is matched quite properly, then it's also quite easy to compare before and after using the bypass button. I always prefer to have unity gain through any plugin so that I easily can enable and disable the plugin without messing up the gain structure in my mastering chain. We did a video about gain staging a while back. You can have a look at that if you want some more details on that workflow. So that is the way that I'm using this compressor. So now I get quite a lot of this character that the compressor has, but I don't get that much of gain reduction because I don't want to reduce the dynamics. I just want the nice effects that it has on the transients. And I think that this compressor has a very nice kind of character. In a rock mix like this, you can get more definition in the kick and snare without making it sound harsher or more aggressive. The transients will often sound a bit clearer and thicker and a bit rounder, but still well defined and sometimes even more defined than without compression. So that's a kind of a character that I like in this plugin. One thing to look out for when you are using this compressor, or for that matter any type of compression on a full mix, is that it's very easy to overdo it and to use too much gain reduction. So make sure to listen for how the dynamics are affected as well. But using this amount of gain reduction that we have discussed here and using the mix button with quite low percentages, then you will probably be in a quite safe zone for getting the best out of the compressor without compressing too much. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Hit the like button if you did, and I will see you in the next one.